Welcome to Your Family Dog, a podcast dedicated to helping families love living with dogs.
Welcome back to Your Family Dog. I'm Tina Spring, and I'm joined today by Julie Fudge Smith and our very special guest, Ryan Yamka, who he's just a guru in nutrition and both veterinary, companion animals and humans. So we thought we would invite him back today to talk about the DCM, or the dilated cardiomyopathy concerns that have now been eclipsed by COVID-19. But in the animal industry, there's been lots of what I like to say is monkeys slinging poop about grain-free and this very special heart disease and the data that came out from the FDA, and our poor vets get hoodwinked in the whole thing, and consumers freak out, and there's all sorts of craziness. And so I wanted to invite Ryan on to chat with us about that so that maybe we have a little more settled information about what's going on and what it all means, and maybe what that means for our companion animals.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Ryan, why don't you give us, if you can, sort of a brief history of what's going on? Why did this suddenly launch onto the horizon?
Sure. So, first off, dilated cardiomyopathy is a heart disease found in dogs, and it can be for many reasons. There could be toxicity effects, could be nutritional effects, could be genetic. And lastly, there's a group called idiopathic, which is a fancy way of saying I don't know, or unknown causes. But it all started back with a golden retriever study that was going on with UC Davis, where they noticed some of the dogs were having prevalence in dilated cardiomyopathy, or I'll call it DCM going forward, so I don't stumble and fumble across the words. And so what they did was they reported it, rightfully so, to the FDA that, hey, we're seeing an uptick. But what they thought they were seeing was that, hey, this group of dogs were being fed grain-free foods, and it wasn't one particular food at the time. As people started becoming more aware of what was going on, and started noticing or raising concern. Unfortunately, one of the leading researchers dubbed the term BEG, which was tied to DCM, and BEG was an acronym for boutique exotic proteins and grain-free foods. And from there, I'll call the snowball, started rolling down the hill and gaining momentum and getting bigger. Where it really kicked it off was one blog by Dr. Freeman, which was written in 2018. And it was really an opinion piece, as all blogs are. Obviously, it doesn't go through scientific, peer-reviewed, or anything like that. It was followed by December 2018 article in the Journal of American Veterinary Medical Association, or it's commonly referred to in the trade as JAVMA, where, again, it was a commentary paper. Lots of people thought it was a peer-reviewed study or paper, and it was not. It was actually one of AVMA's first commentaries that they've had, and hopefully the last, because in that commentary, most veterinarians did not realize that it was not a peer-reviewed publication. It was no different than the blog that was written earlier. But B and C was it actually cited 2 unpublished studies. And lastly, it cited her blog. So it had no data to support it, yet it was calling out the potential association to it. And as a result, it started gaining momentum as far as what was going on. At a certain point, the FDA put out press release asking, veterinarians to start providing input for what they dubbed an investigation. So they wanted to see, hey, is what this veterinary community is seeing true? And is there a cause and effect? And over that time, there was 560 cases reported in. By the time they did their June or July 2019 update, what they saw was that they could only confirm, roughly 60% of the cases coming in. But more importantly, there was no association or cause and effect going on. And so what do I mean by that? So for argument's sake, if you were feeding a canna and if there was something going on, you would expect all the cases to be, say, pork and squash, right? But it wasn't. It was just all over the place. But yet they reported 62 or whatever the number was of canna foods. But when you look behind the data, there was no association. And in fact, when you actually looked at whether or not they were boutique foods, they actually weren't. They were actually made by top manufacturers in the U.S. People just didn't realize it, which was a shame, again, on how the data got represented and how the boutique word came out. In fact, 8 of the 10 manufacturers for the foods were making $220 million or better a year and account for roughly 25% of the top companies. They're within the top 25, with the exception of Fromm. Fromm was on there, but they're hardly boutique because the Fromm family actually has been in the vet business longer than anybody else. They're actually the ones that discovered, patented, and ultimately launched distemper vaccines for dogs and cats and foxes back in 1939, I think the patent was. So a lot of things were not played out in there. And more importantly, the number one protein source happened to be chicken. 75% of the protein sources were not quote unquote exotic. The only one that resonated fairly high was kangaroo, which was literally only 2 companies that were in that number. And I forget who owned what, but for argument's sake, I want to say 75% was a Signature, 25% was California Natural. So it wasn't all kangaroo products. And then you actually had grain foods that were reported in as well, even though they asked for grain free in the investigation. And so a lot of people say, well, why wasn't any of these foods recalled? And the reality of it is because there's no data to support it. And the example I use to get customers to understand it is, if you think of this time last year when Hills was going through literally their largest recall and probably the largest recall since melamine for pet food industry was with their vitamin D toxicity and illness in canned foods. Well, there's just as many animals, if not more, that got sick and died from vitamin D toxicity. Well, there was a root cause. They knew the cause and effect. They knew the toxicity signs. And so it resulted in a recall. With the grain-free diets, there has been no cause and effect. And lastly, when you look at the breeds that were reported in, depending on who looks at the data, it's anywhere from 50 to 75% of the breeds reported in have known predispositions to DCM. And probably the most important thing too, when you dive in deeper to the data, is you would expect if digestibility and taurine and stuff like that was the root cause of it, you would expect to see other signs of deficiencies from taurine. But more importantly, what you don't see in the data is in obviously weight management foods. The goal is to decrease calories and tank digestibility, right? That's why you put all the fiber in there, make them feel full and push a lot of the nutrients out. You would expect to see a lot of weight management foods in those case studies that were reported. And there was, I think, a total of 3.
Wow.
And the 3 reported didn't have carnitine or taurine added to it. Most weight management foods do, as we discussed in our last podcast. And so there just really is no foundation to support what the initial idea was there. And so unfortunately, what started out with a small group of animals turned into hysteria through the media because of, as I refer to it, the 16 brands chart. And the reality of it is if you look at the data, Science Diet's on there, Pro Plan's in there, Royal Canin's in there. There's lots of brands that go beyond it. And unfortunately, in the case of Blue Buffalo, when you look at that number of 31, they have 7 brands today, but only 4 of them were named in there, and 20% of them were actually grain diets. And so that bar that you see in that chart, everybody automatically jumped off the cliff saying, well, that's showing you all the grain-free cases. And the answer is no, it's showing you all the reported cases tied to that brand. And so it's even reporting grain products in those bar charts.
So, Ryan, we're talking about under 600 reported cases when the FDA was actively requesting reports of cases, right? So we can assume that many were reported, that people took the time to do that, or veterinarians, or did individuals even report?
Typically you could do both.
Okay.
So the way the food safety portal is set up is you as a consumer can start filling in all the information. And you can always put, your veterinarian's contact information or update them when they contact you. One of the mistakes or misnomers out there is everybody thinks they have to have all the information to file. You don't. And so you can go in there and start setting it up and give them all your contact information. And at least in the pet food industry, it can take as little as 2 complaints for them to start an investigation.
So my question is, so we have these under 600 cases reported, right, by whether it's an individual consumer, a dog owner, or whether it's a veterinarian making a report of a case on their caseload. Do we know how many dogs approximately in the United States were eating grain-free at the time of this big problem?
It's going to be a lot. So
are we talking, do we mean a lot like 25,000? Do we mean a lot like 10 million?
Yeah, it'll be millions. Because if you actually look at the grain-free marketplace in independent retail or pet retail, grain-free products account for 50% of the sales. And if you look at grocery channel, it's 20% of sales, and that's based off of Nielsen data. And so if you figure, if you start doing the math real quickly, you're in the millions. But more importantly, in 2006, Sanderson actually wrote a review on DCM, and I forget what article it is, but she reported at that point of time, and this is 2006, so keep in mind this is pre-melamine, so grain-free wasn't even a spark in somebody's eye. In most cases, is going to be either on your super high end or it would be therapeutic only. So at that point in time, she was quoting numbers that in a total dog population, it could be anywhere from 0.5% to 1.1%. And so, okay, quick math on that. Well, if you look at 1 million dogs, that's 5,000 to 11,000 dogs, right? Just by default. And that's before grain-free was popular. Now, all of a sudden, you tell veterinarians start looking for DCM, and more importantly, grain-free. It's like, okay, well, you told them what to go look for. You shouldn't be surprised in the data that you got back.
Right, but it still seems like that would be crazy that would be assuming a huge underreportment of cases when reporting is really easy and is being solicited. Like, it's not just that the FDA is sitting back and waiting and saying like, well, we'll just see what people tell us about. It's my understanding they're actively pursuing case information to try to help the consumers.
They were, and honestly, I think they did a disservice when they did their investigation announcement. They should have said all DCM cases, and then bring in all diets to see, hey, is there truly a diet effect in there? Because for argument's sake, the fact that you got 10% that came in that were grain related cases reported tells you that, hey, there's something else potentially going on there. And it makes it harder for you to really figure out, is it truly exotic proteins? Is it truly grains? Is it truly peas? And more importantly, no genetic testing was done on any of the animals. So they didn't even rule out genetics. And there's certain things that came in where the animals had concurrent diseases. For example, Lyme disease, which is known to have issues and, obviously causes renal and heart issues later on in life. And so how do you rule that out? And then a lot of them had GI issues. And if you look in human medicine, when you get, people with celiac disease and other GI related diseases, they actually get dilated cardiomyopathy tied to carnitine deficiency. And so when you actually look at those things, you're like, you probably have more questions, than answers. But more importantly, when you also dive into the data, the taurine levels were all over the place, regardless of breed. So you had low taurine, middle taurine, high taurine. The question is that even accurate? Because, do we know what a normal is for a golden retriever? And based off that UC Davis study, they questioned that. And so what we might think is, high for them might be a norm for them. And, for a poodle, what we consider low, that might be their norm. I don't think people really know those answers either. And when you ask people, do you have to take a fasting or after feeding taurine? Nobody can ever give me those answers. And I also know that how you send them to the lab matters, because if it's not refrigerated and stored properly, by default, you have degradation in the blood. And so you could be getting false lows, if you will. And so, which is also brought up in that UC Davis study.
So when families are going to their vet, suddenly this conversation about, well, what kind of food are you feeding comes up. And it's anecdotal, but I'm getting lots of reports by the customers I'm coming in contact with that their veterinarians are really, really pushing them off of foods that they really felt like they were feeding those foods because they thought they were higher quality. They thought that they were blessing their animals, and they're like, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. And they're pushing people kind of toward the Purina, Science Diet, Royal Canin foods. What do families need to know?
So, like we talked about in our other podcast, it's, people really need to become their own advocates for their dogs and cats. And so, the challenge, and this is part of my frustration that I've seen and witnessed, and obviously, with when neighbors and friends know what you do for a living, you get a phone call real quick when, they have a suspected DCM or other things. But, one family down the street, and I'll give two examples. They went into a local vet that I know, and he actually feeds raw, but his associate actually waited on him. And so the conversation would have been completely different because her bedside manner just isn't up to snuff. And I'll leave it at that. They came in and they, dog was coughing and everything. And they thought, dog had some kind of respiratory issue. So they immediately treated with antibiotics. Dog still had the issues. And so they did an x-ray and saw an enlarged heart, and immediately the veterinarian jumped to, well, are you feeding grain-free? It's probably DCM tied to grain-free foods. And so obviously, and this is where, I caution veterinarians is you got to be careful with what you say, because if you don't have the right answer and you can't show it and you can't answer it, you send home those consumers upset thinking they're killing Fido. Right. And
right.
In this case, they called me up. I asked, did they run blood taurine, blood carnitine? When are they setting up the echocardiogram to see if there's truly an arrhythmia going on, and if it's truly DCM to confirm it, because they weren't cardiologists. It was a traditional vet. And long story short, she didn't answer any of those questions. And the other question I asked was, how many nutritional related DCM cases have you seen this year, or more importantly, DCM cases? And the answer was, this was the first one. So it was like, well, why did you immediately jump to grain free? And so Once all the testing was said and done, come to find out the dog just has an enlarged heart. And it wasn't DCM, and they ruled out that it wasn't nutritionally related. But yet, because of the backlog we have up here in the Northeast, and there's only so many specialists up here, they went through 3 weeks of thinking that they were killing their dog. And literally, my friend's wife was crying every night over it because she was counting days. Because if you don't ever, like I always tell people, don't go on the internet looking up symptoms of what you have, because you're always going to see the bad stuff on the front end, right? And never the educational part. Well, unfortunately, she thought she was hurting her dog. A different vet, 2 counties north of me. And I talk that way because I've been living in the South for a while. So instead of towns are an hour away. But they immediately went to they asked the question, are you feeding grain free? Well, it's DCM. Well, when all the testing and stuff came back, it was pancreatitis. It had nothing to do with the heart. And it's actually a lot of these people, because they read that commentary in JAVMA that took it as a scientifically peer-reviewed article, that they immediately started going that way. And so why, back to your question, are they only recommending Hills, Royal Canin, and Purina? Well, that's what they're accustomed to. That's what they've been taught school-wise. And, obviously they have the therapeutic brands and stuff in there. The misconception that a lot of veterinarians have is that they're all quote unquote WSAVA compliant, and WSAVA is the World's Small Animal Veterinary Association. I believe they're based out of Canada, but it was actually founded by those 3 companies to say, here's the criteria for a good food. And if you actually look at it, it'll tell you, hey, they should be doing AFCO feeding studies. Well, if you actually look at a lot of the Hills products, Purina products, and Royal Canin products, they actually say formulated to be complete and balanced. They make the assumption that all of their foods have been AFCO tested, where they haven't been. And more importantly, part of WSAVA is you're supposed to have proper procedures in place from a food safety and quality standpoint. Well, based off of what we know from the Hills recall that they had in 2019, an FDA warning letter that was sent out to them in, I believe, November of last year, the root cause of the vitamin D issue was Hills was not following their own standard operating procedures and protocols. And in the warning letter that the FDA gave to Hills, where Hills tried to blame it on the supplier, it was, no, you didn't test inbound ingredients and you didn't test finished goods, is the gist of it, right? But more importantly, when they sent their corrective actions to the FDA, in the FDA warning letter, the FDA clearly states, well, we don't know if these are corrective actions because you weren't following them to begin with. So we're going to have to come back and do an unannounced audit to make sure you're actually adhering to that. So if they're a WSAVA brand and you're violating one of the key things for WSAVA, well, you shouldn't be a WSAVA brand anymore. And so that's where the BS of WSAVA brands come in, is just because you could check the boxes, that group, all they do is they give you a checklist. There's no teeth or anything binding to quote unquote being a WSAVA brand. And there's lots of other companies out there that are technically WSAVA compliant. For example, our company is, because I'm a board certified nutritionist. I formulate all the foods, but that doesn't mean that, all veterinarians know that, because obviously I don't have the time nor the budget to go be educating all these veterinarians. And obviously I'm not going to be paying for scholarships and residencies and all the other stuff that goes with it.
And feeding their dogs for free.
Yeah, in case of Purina, if they feed them for free, the other 2 are discounts. Some of them, if you look at the veterinary clinics, literally they're named the Purina Nutrition Center, and obviously have all their therapeutics and foods there. So whether they want to acknowledge, and they'll get, and veterinarians will get pissy about it and say, well, I wasn't bought by them. You might not, you probably weren't, but you don't understand there might be an underlying bias towards it. And it's easier to take people to go back to what you know or what you were taught or old school thinking versus learning all the different foods that are out there and why people are doing it. And so like for example, when I talked in the last podcast about gluten-free foods may not be for the dog at all. It could be for that household that has the kid that has a gluten sensitivity, right? And in this day and age, seems like it's either that or peanuts. But the reality of it is they have the right to have a dog or cat. They don't want gluten in the house, so there's a purpose for it. It might not be for the dog. It's a good food. It's a healthy food, but that gluten-free claim might not have anything to do with the dog in some cases. It has everything to do with the lifestyle of the person. But yet the veterinarian, being very scientific minded, as I am, will go, well, there's no need for gluten-free foods, so that brand sucks. And they dismiss them as a brand totally, instead of trying to understand, well, why are you, Mr. or Mrs. Client, feeding a grain-free food? Why are you feeding a gluten-free food? Why are you feeding raw? Why are you doing this and that and the other thing? And that's the shame in that. And so, by default, they end up going back to what instead of stepping up their game and becoming what I would call nutritional authorities, which they're no longer, and they haven't been for quite some time. In fact, if you look at Dr. Millard's data, and more importantly, what recently came out by Cascadia Capital, veterinarians haven't been authority leaders in nutrition for at least 6, 7, 8 years. And it's actually been pet stores and independent pet retailers.
I would agree. I was just going to say that that was a very hit locally. We had a veterinarian in our area, and I remember when I went to first see him, and I was talking about nutrition and wanting to do raw, and he was just like, I don't know why you want to do that. Why don't you do this, and so on and so forth. And I just walked away and did what I wanted to do for my dog. Turns out his wife decided to open a pet store in the house next door to where his veterinary clinic is, and she started doing research. And pretty soon he's all on board about, good nutrition, and everything that is in that particular pet food store has been recommended by the Whole Dog Journal. They tried to stay on top of things. They were going to try and do raw, but they just couldn't handle the freezer capacity that they thought they would need and that kind of stuff. Sure. But they are no longer saying, don't feed raw. And they're no longer saying, this is the only brand. And in fact, they're no longer recommending Hill's, Purina, and Royal Canin. And so I kind of feel like sometimes I understand that vets have that there's an awful lot to learn. They also don't know much about behavior. Many of them, right. They'll turn to, like my vet, who is no longer this particular one. He'll say, Julie, you're the expert on behavior. We work together with clients. And I sometimes think there's an awful lot of pressure on veterinarians to be everything. Not only do you have to be a clinician, and you have to be, a doctor, and you have to be, a compassionate person as I'm dealing with the death of my dog or whatever, they can't be everything. So I was really appreciative of the fact that the vet's wife stepped in and said, let's do this, and let's do this right. So I agree with you. I think vets need to be better educated, but I also have a little bit of sympathy for them that they're asked to do so much.
Oh, I absolutely like I agree. And to a certain extent, when I'm talking to families, I talk about okay, when you go to the dentist, what kind of these companies are smart, right? They're trying to make as much money as they can. They're trying to get as much market share as they can. And so they're smart about it. If a specific toothpaste company is providing free samples to every dentist, so that they can say 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this, that lends credibility to their brand, whether or not that credibility is deserved. And I think in animal related industries, I kind of sort of see the same thing. I had one veterinarian say, well, I have a specialty in poultry, and this company makes a really great poultry feed, so then I assume they make a great dog and cat food.
Night and day.
Yeah. And I was just kind of stunned.
Yeah.
Right. When
just because you make a good monkey chow doesn't mean you're going to make a good dog chow.
Right. And so for me, where I started on this whole journey was looking at ingredients and learning what those ingredients are and what they mean. And and then making a decision about, am I comfortable feeding Animal Digest to my dogs? Are my dogs paying a cost to eating that? And I think it's hard for families to find good, credible information. And I don't want to be contentious with vets. I love vets. Some of my favorite people on the planet are veterinarians. But I agree, like they don't get a ton of information about behavior. I'm not seeing vets say, hey, add more, broccoli and carrot and whole egg and venison to your dog's food. It'll be great for them. And I just don't understand where that disconnect is, that fresh food is somehow horrible and dangerous. I mean, to my knowledge, broccoli it's not harmful for a family to feed some broccoli and some zucchini and chicken on top of a good quality kibble to enhance the nutrition for a family dog.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Dr. Karen Becker's quotes is one of my favorites is, the gist of it is her field or medical profession her field of medical profession is the only group out there that says processed foods is better than fresh foods. And so, it says a lot right there. But the reality of it is they take and the good ones will tell you, and there's no shame in their game. They'll tell you they don't know when they don't know and stuff like that. And they're not always going to have the answers, even though they feel that they have to. The ones I like are the ones that say, I don't know.
Right.
And I've had those before. And then
or
they say,
it depends.
Hey,
yes. That's Tina's and my big
say,
phrase is, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
And then what they do is they say, but we're going to run these diagnostics first, and hopefully it tells us it's this or that. And if that doesn't work, we'll run these diagnostics. And they explain to you as they're going through, and they're having a discussion, right? And they're willing to say, I don't know, we need to run this and that and the other. But the good ones will also tell you that when they took nutrition, and the only nutrition they took would be the equivalent of freshman year in college, so their first year of vet school, it was probably a 3-hour semester hour course, and then they don't talk about it again unless you want to go into that field to get a PhD and board certification, so on and so forth. And so, with that being said, at the same time, they'll say, well, somebody needs to teach me. Well, the smaller companies don't have the budget to be going out and teaching, and they don't have the budget to run marketing campaigns and advertising either. And so, back in the days of when I worked at Blue Buffalo, a lot of them would say, well, you're just a marketing company. And I would laugh. I said, well, so is Hills. They just chose to market to you instead of to the consumer. Because instead of the millions of dollars going to TV ads, they were doing millions of dollars towards feeding programs to sponsoring societies, to sponsoring conferences and everything else. And so they just focused a different way to do their marketing and advertising spend. And so, it's one of those you just got to keep in mind. And when you're your own advocate for your pet food, I think, you bringing the information forward to your vet on what your food is and why you're feeding it, helps in that discussion, instead of it being kind of one-sided and you going, oh my God, I need to go feed science diet, because they're not going to know why you're feeding what you're feeding, or better yet, how to even compare your food, because if they don't know what you're feeding, they're going to go with what they know. And so in that case, there's going to be consumers that are more educated than the vet on nutrition, and that's fine. But it's also their duty to share that knowledge and help educate if they think, and have that discussion with a veterinarian. And I don't think people realize that they can have that open discussion. And it's no different. Like I always tell people, it's no different in human medicine. It's you can have those discussions. Should I go on this cholesterol med, or should I stop drinking beer and eat healthier? That's a discussion everybody has in human medicine, and it's the same discussion you can have in veterinary as well.
Right.
So if we had to make guesses, and maybe you're not willing to do this, which is totally okay too. If we had to make guesses about why this DCM thing blew up, like, was it political? Was it just a big emotional overreaction? Was it sadly about market share? Like, what do we think this whole thing, was it much ado about nothing? Like, what do we think that all was?
Yes. I think, it was a perfect storm, and unfortunately, when you look at the popular press that came out after the 2019 update and obviously walked you through on how, large breeds were involved. It wasn't grain-free specific. It surely wasn't exotic proteins. It surely wasn't boutique brands. And even the quote-unquote Wasava brands were listed on there if you dive deeper into the data. Unfortunately, and more importantly, that 16 companies graph wasn't just grain-free foods. It was also grain foods. The thing that really took off is popular press saw that graph, and the headlines pretty much, paraphrasing, is grain-free foods killing your dogs because of heart disease. And that's where popular press ran with it. And if you look around that timing and how New York Times and other, even on NBC nightly news, it made it. And, stuff like that typically doesn't make it to the nightly news, especially when you got things like North Korea building nuclear bombs, and well, now it would be all coronavirus, probably wouldn't even bubble up. But, it made for good headlines. And when you see something that does that, obviously you go back to the discussions we've had. Now people act emotionally instead of rationally, and they think, oh my God, I'm killing my dog. And the vet thinks, oh my God, you're killing your dog, where nobody stopped to actually look at the data and say, this data doesn't show anything, and stop and ask the question, well, if this was truly going on, why is there no recalls going on?
Well,
right.
And that was my question. Like, would the FDA do a recall if they saw data that said specifically, yes, this is a causation?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what they did with vitamin D, right? With Hill's canned products starting in January 2019. And then when the FDA actually, and everybody says it was a voluntary recall. Well, no recalls are ever voluntary. The FDA says you're doing a recall, and if you don't do it, then it's forced.
Right. It's like taxes.
Yeah.
It's only voluntary to a point.
Yeah. Until 5 years later, they catch you and they throw you in jail, and then it's no longer voluntary. But in that case, if you actually read what the warning letter and the documents that the FDA had, the FDA kept on going back to Hills and saying, no, we don't think you got all the lots that were involved. Go further out. And that's why they had a second recall tied to it, a third recall tied to it. I think only 3 recalls, but that was because the FDA was saying you need to look further out to see where the issue truly ends and starts. And so, in that case, cause and effect, gone, right? Think melamine, cause and effect, recalls, right? So if there's a cause and effect, out it goes. Salmonella, out it goes, right? And in this case, there is no cause and effect. In fact, if you actually look at the question and answer sections of the FDA says we don't recommend you changing your food at this time, nor do we recommend saying that do we have data to say that grain-free food is bad, because we also saw foods come in that contain grains as well.
So then why are vets sending out these letters to their customers saying, oh, this guy is falling?
Because they watch the nightly news.
That, and also a lot of them, when I was at the Veterinary Meeting Expo and I presented my slides to them, and I put up that 2018 article from JAVMA that talked about the association of BEG foods to DCM. I asked how many people have read this. Everybody in the room raised their hands. I said, how many people this time started suggesting everybody move away from grain-free? Everybody raised their hands. And then I asked the question, how many people think this is a scientifically peer-reviewed article? Everybody raised their hands. And when I said, well, let's dive deeper, and I said, and I went to the next slide where I literally highlighted the word commentary, explained what it was. I highlighted unpublished, and then I highlighted the blog that were the 3 points that led you to the belief that there were. I said, this isn't scientifically peer reviewed. This is purely a commentary. And I said, more importantly, the unpublished data that they walk you through in that JAVMA article, I said, we're actually going to go to that UC Davis study and look at that data. And with those golden retrievers, the dogs that they had, none of them were on large breed foods. They were all regular adult foods, so they're not probably getting carnitine or taurine added to them, which most large breed adult foods have. And secondly, what a lot of people don't realize is out of that group, which never makes it out there, is 4 of the dogs actually switched to another grain-free food and didn't have issues. And so what happened in that study, and they didn't mention what the foods were, by the way, but what happened in that study is not only did they switch foods, they also gave them heart medication, carnitine, and taurine supplementation. So you don't know.
So we don't know what fixed
the cause, if it was taurine deficiency, if it was carnitine deficiency, there's a lot of unknowns, and they never did genetic testing on them. And so they left more questions than answers. But if you actually read the article points all that out, as a good scientifically peer-reviewed article does. It says, hey, here's what we have. They literally say there is no cause and effect here. We believe it's multifactorial, being potentially tied to diet, metabolism, and genetics. And then they go through and list out, here's all the pitfalls and shortcomings of it. But yet when the JAVMA article came out, they've only focused on 24 dogs were eating bag diets and had DCM. Well, that's what they selected for in the study. And it's like, and that's the other part I tell people is, don't take somebody's word for it. Go look at that other study and read it, because they could be picking pieces out to support their cause.
So in that vein, Ryan, right? What if people say, okay, well, this is all just Ryan's opinion. Who else, what other veterinary nutrition, board certified, well-educated people in the industry are other scientists that they can go to check what you're saying and to make sure what you're saying is accurate?
Yeah, so one person that's out there, and he's actually presented at the IPPE Expo in, I want to say, it was a few weeks after I presented at VMX, is Dr. Joe Vargas. He's double board certified in internal medicine as well as nutrition.
He's at UGA, isn't he?
He is. And he's very much of the mindset as I am. The data is the data. Show people the data, let people draw their own conclusions. And he literally presented similar deal. And to his credit, which, I agree with it, is, the problem is an industry and an FDA problem, not a grain-free problem. And so meaning the FDA screwed up on how they represented the data going out the door. They should have done it as the PDF like they did with the jerky data back in 2011, where it was really tied to 3 or 4 major brands coming out of China. Yet they never made a bar graph there, which would have simplified it for everybody. And there was tied to 3 or 4 brands. And from that standpoint, the fact that the industry has not responded to say, you know what, I'm Mr. Champion and I make a Canine origin and I feed, 20 million dogs a year my food, and there were 60 animals. Nobody came out and made those types of statements. And so he's correct when he said it's a pet food industry issue, because those brands never took the time to respond and figured they'd just bury their heads in the sand and it would go away, while other brands obviously thrived off of it because they had veterinary recommendations being pushed in through Purina, Royal Canin, and Hills.
It's kind of infuriating.
It is when there's no science there to back it up. Fortunately, I'm a geek, so I actually looked at all 78 pages that got reported in. And fortunately, I know Dan Shuloff, who actually did Freedom of Information Act to get all, and I read them all too. I want to say it was like 1,500 pages of emails and documents tied to the DCM investigation. And he'll have some interesting things coming out, but even in that data, it doesn't support anything. Again, if it was, they would say, hey, there's a recall, or we need to look at, for argument's sake, we need to go look at pea farmers and see how they're treating, why are certain pea products on there and not others, because there's lots of, if you look at, and again, in the Nielsen data, if you look at kibble, 45% of kibble out there is grain-free. So you're feeding a lot of kibble, right? If you think about it. So there's lots of healthy animals on those kibble diets. But when you get into the alternative dry, and that includes freeze-dried, air-dried, dehydrated, 95% of those foods are grain-free. Well, why are you not seeing the issues in the other dried foods? Or better yet, no canned foods were named in that list, and 52% of that market share is in canned foods, traditional, retorted cans, is grain-free. So if it's a grain-free problem, why isn't it not showing up in other food forms?
Those are great questions. Those are great questions.
Well, and is it showing up? And is it showing up in other countries? I mean, we're not the only country that does grain-free.
If you talk to people in Canada and stuff like that, the answer will be no. So, but it depends on what vets are trying to look for it. But no, we're the only country where federally they were investigating and looking at. And it was, when you look at the emails, it was actually being pushed by 3 people. But you'll see that in upcoming press releases and stuff.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you for coming and giving us information. Hold on, Julie's got something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you, Ryan, could provide us with some links that we can put on the website that people want to take a look at some of this stuff themselves, sure, we would be happy to put that on the website so that they can do some of their own investigation. So we'll make sure that those links are there. And
we'd love to have you back when there's more information coming forward, and I'm sure that we'll get some listener reviews of people asking questions, and we'll hit you up for some answers.
Yeah, and just one thing I'll leave you with is the FD. No matter what you read in the papers or on Facebook, the FDA, AFCO, or or AKC, those 3 organizations never recommend foods. In fact, if you actually go on the website for FDA and AFCO, they literally, FDA in FDA's cases, big bold letters, we do not recommend food. Same with AFCO. And what you'll see is another one where a list of 16 brands are, and you'll see an AKC link on there. If you actually click on that AKC link, their veterinarian says there is no cause and effect with grain-free diets, and in fact, FDA is working with other people to see if there is. So the person that put that list of 16 together with that AKC link, they're misleading people. And so when you actually click on it and see what the verbiage is, they aren't even recommending changing foods or recommending any foods, period. And so a lot of people are unfortunately playing off of fear versus facts. But that's something for everybody to keep in mind, is those 3 organizations will never recommend foods. Because A, it puts them at legal and liability risks, and B, they're supposed to be quote unquote not private companies and doing recommendations, right? And so from that standpoint, that's the other thing to keep in mind.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you'll come back and talk to us about advertising claims and how to dig through all of that stuff with pet food, but we will leave that for another day.
Sounds good.
Thanks for all you're doing to serve all the families and dogs. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Your Family Dog. Got questions? Interesting ideas? Visit www.yourfamilydogpodcast.com to share your thoughts.